She begged him not to call police when he found her chained in his well. What she whispered next about who put her there made him realize he wasn't her rescuer. He was next. The sun beat down like a hammer on an anvil, and Jake's horse kicked up clouds of dust that seemed to hang in the air forever. His canteen had been empty for hours. The frontier town ahead looked like a mirage, but mirages don't have wooden buildings that creak in the wind or dogs sleeping in whatever shade they can find. Wells were everything out here. Everything. Without water, you might as well dig your own grave because the desert would do it for you anyway. Most folks don't realize how brutal it was to create these lifelines. Men would spend weeks digging by hand, sometimes going down 60 feet or more, praying they'd hit water before their backs gave out or the walls caved in. The smart settlers knew what to look for. They'd search the land for natural springs, scanning for patches of green grass or watching where animals gathered at dawn. Rivers were tempting, but seasoned pioneers stayed back from the banks. Flash floods could wipe out everything you'd built in a single night. Better to dig near water sources than right next to them. Then there's the genius of spring houses. These weren't just fancy storage, they were survival. Picture a small stone building constructed right over a natural spring, designed to keep water cool even when the sun was trying to cook everything alive. The constant flow prevented stagnation, and the thick walls provided insulation. Families would lower crocks of milk and butter into the cold water, creating their own primitive refrigeration system. Pretty clever for people who supposedly lived rough lives, right? But the real game changer came in the 1870s when Arizona's irrigation system started spreading like spiderwebs across the territory. These weren't just random ditches either. We're talking about carefully planned networks that could transform thousands of acres of barren land into productive farms. Towns began springing up around these irrigation hubs because water meant crops, crops meant trade, and trade meant survival. The engineering was surprisingly sophisticated. Settlers would divert streams through hand-dug channels, creating a system of gates and controls that could direct water exactly where it was needed. Some of these channels stretched for miles, requiring constant maintenance and cooperation between neighbors who might otherwise be feuding over cattle or property lines. What's fascinating is how these irrigation systems completely changed the social structure of frontier communities. Suddenly, water wasn't just about individual survival, it became a shared resource that required organization and planning. Towns that figured this out thrived. Those that didn't became footnotes in history books. Jake rode into town thinking only about his immediate thirst, but he was actually entering a complex web of water politics that could make or break entire communities. The well in the town square looked inviting enough, surrounded by a few locals who seemed friendly, but frontier appearances could be deceiving, and not every well welcomed strangers. Some wells in these parts had darker stories attached to them. Stories that made even the toughest cowboys think twice before lowering their buckets. The townsfolk didn't say much about the old well at first. Jake noticed how conversations stopped when he walked by, eyes darted away. Someone would cough and change the subject to the weather or cattle prices. Then the barkeeper leaned across the counter with that look people get when they're about to share something they probably shouldn't. "That well on the edge of town," he whispered. "Nobody draws from it anymore, hasn't been touched in months." Well, that's odd. Water was liquid gold in 1870s Arizona. You didn't just abandon a perfectly good well, unless it wasn't perfectly good anymore. The truth about frontier wells tells a darker story than most people realize. These weren't just holes in the ground that occasionally ran dry. Some collapsed without warning, creating sinkholes that swallowed livestock whole. Others developed structural problems that made them death traps for anyone foolish enough to climb down. But the worst wells, those were the ones people poisoned on purpose. During water disputes, and there were plenty in the desert, rivals sometimes dumped dead animals or worse into each other's water sources. Arsenic was popular too, since mining towns had plenty lying around. One documented case in Colorado involved a rancher who poisoned 3 wells belonging to his neighbor over a boundary dispute. Killed 2 children before anyone figured out what happened. The thing about water scarcity is it makes people do terrible things. Wells weren't just protected by wooden covers or stone walls. Armed guards stood watch during the worst droughts. Families took shifts through the night. Some wells had so many shootouts nearby that locals nicknamed them bullet gardens. Makes sense when you consider what happened to towns that lost their water supply, right? Ghost towns weren't just abandoned because gold ran out or railroads changed routes. Many died the slow death of thirst. Buildings stood empty while tumbleweeds collected around dry wellheads that once sustained hundreds of people. Then there were the territorial wars over irrigation rights. Arizona's canal systems in the 1870s controlled thousands of acres of farmland. Whoever controlled the water controlled everything else. Desperate men would sabotage entire irrigation networks, leaving crops to shrivel and communities to scatter. The barkeeper's voice dropped even lower. Strange sounds come from that well at night. Some folks say they hear crying. Jake raised an eyebrow. Superstition ran thick in frontier towns, especially around places where bad things happened. Wells had a particular reputation for harboring secrets. Their depths made perfect hiding spots for evidence that needed to disappear forever. What kind of crying? Jake asked. The barkeeper shrugged nervously. The kind that don't sound like wind. Statistics from the period show that thousands of people fell into wells accidentally each year. Poor maintenance killed more settlers than some historians care to admit. Rotten rope, crumbling stonework, wooden ladders that gave way under weight. But what if someone didn't fall? Jake finished his drink and headed toward the door. That abandoned well was starting to sound like more than just a local curiosity. Something about the way people avoided talking about it suggested a story worth investigating. The desert wind picked up as he stepped outside, and for just a moment he could swear he heard something carried on the breeze. Jake stared down into that black hole, wondering if his curiosity was about to get him killed. The rope looked older than dirt, frayed in spots that made his stomach churn, but something about those warnings from the townsfolk didn't sit right. People don't just abandon perfectly good wells in the desert unless there's a damn good reason. Wells back then weren't exactly built with safety codes in mind. Most had crude wooden ladders or worn ropes for hauling up water buckets. When those broke, well, you'd better hope someone heard you screaming. The rope Jake found coiled near this well had seen better days, probably better decades. He tested it anyway. What choice did he have? The descent felt like dropping into the earth's belly. Rope burns stung his palms as he lowered himself hand over hand. 20 feet down, the desert heat vanished. 30 feet, and he could barely see the circle of sky above. The temperature drop was incredible. Wells naturally stayed cool underground, which explains why desperate folks sometimes used them as hideouts during scorching summers. Then there's the air problem. Nobody talks about. Old wells could trap bad gases or simply run out of breathable air. Smart outlaws knew this trick though. They'd duck into abandoned wells to escape possers, betting they could outlast the heat above ground. Some made it, others didn't. Jake's boots finally hit bottom with a wet squelch. Not a good sign in a supposedly dry well. His eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering down, and the smell hit him: stale water, rotting wood, and something else he couldn't place. Something that made his skin crawl. Historical records show thousands of well accidents in the 1800s. People fell in, got trapped, or suffocated in the depths. Most frontier towns had at least one horror story about someone who went down a well and never came back up. Poor maintenance killed more folks than Indian raids in some areas, but nobody likes talking about mundane deaths. The weird part: this well wasn't empty like everyone claimed. Jake could hear water trickling somewhere in the darkness, echoing off stone walls that felt solid enough. Someone had definitely been lying about this place being dried up. He pulled out a match, struck it against the rough stone. The tiny flame revealed carved handholds in the wall, recent ones, judging by the fresh scrape marks. Someone had been using this well regularly, but for what? That's when the light caught something metallic gleaming near the far wall. Not the glint of water or wet stone. Something manufactured. Something that definitely shouldn't be 60 feet underground in an abandoned well. Jake's match burned down to his fingers and he cursed as darkness swallowed him again. But that brief glimpse was enough to know he'd stumbled onto something the townsfolk really didn't want found. The question was whether he'd live long enough to figure out what those metal objects were, and why someone had gone to such trouble to hide them down here. Jake's boots hit solid ground at the bottom of the well. The air felt thick and stale, like breathing through wet cloth. His eyes adjusted to the darkness, and that's when he saw it. A metallic glint, catching what little light filtered down from above. Shackles, heavy iron shackles attached to something that made his blood run cold. The restraints weren't just lying there abandoned. They were locked around someone's ankles. A figure huddled against the curved stone wall, barely moving. Jake's heart hammered against his ribs as he realized what he'd stumbled into. Frontier towns used shackles more than most people think. Local blacksmiths hammered out iron restraints for sheriffs who needed to hold prisoners before the next circuit judge rolled through town. But these weren't sitting in some jail cell. These were hidden 60 feet underground where nobody would hear screaming. The metalwork looked crude but effective, thick iron bands connected by a short chain that wouldn't allow much movement. Traveling blacksmiths sold restraints like these to mining camps and remote settlements where disputes got ugly fast. When silver or gold was involved, people did terrible things to protect their claims. Well, that's one way to make someone disappear. Law enforcement in places like 1870s Arizona was basically non-existent. A sheriff might cover hundreds of square miles, visiting some towns only once a month. Corrupt officials sometimes worked with outlaws, using isolated spots like abandoned wells as makeshift prisons. The perfect crime needed the perfect hiding place, and what could be more perfect than a hole in the ground everyone avoided? The weird part is how often wells became emergency holding cells. When regular jails overflowed or didn't exist, lawmen got creative. They'd lower prisoners down with ropes, knowing the depth made escape nearly impossible. Some wells had wooden ladders, but smart captors removed those first. Then there's the temperature factor. Underground stays cool even in blazing desert heat. 60 feet down it might be 20 degrees cooler than the surface. For someone planning to keep a prisoner alive for weeks or months that mattered. Too much heat kills faster than thirst. Mining disputes created the worst scenarios. When claim jumpers tried stealing someone's strike, violence erupted quickly. Escaped convicts and runaway slaves faced similar fates, shackled and hidden where no search party would think to look. The iron itself tells a story about frontier brutality that history books often skip. Historical records from the period mention hundreds of missing persons cases that went unsolved. Young women vanished from wagon trains. Miners disappeared after discovering promising veins. Settlers who found good water sources sometimes never made it to the next town to file their claims. Most people assume the Wild West dangers came from shootouts and horse thieves. The real horror happened in places like this, quiet, methodical, hidden from view. Jake knelt beside the figure, his hands shaking as he reached toward what he now realized was a young woman. She was alive but barely. Her story would reveal something far worse than a simple crime. The water wars had claimed another victim. The figure huddled at the bottom wasn't what Jake expected. A girl, maybe 16, with hollow cheeks and matted hair that looked like it hadn't seen sunlight in weeks. Her wrists bore rope burns. Her ankles, raw and bleeding where the iron shackles had rubbed against bone. She didn't speak when Jake called down to her, just stared up with eyes that had seen too much darkness. Frontier towns weren't exactly known for their stellar law enforcement. In remote regions like 1870s Arizona, a sheriff might cover hundreds of square miles with nothing but a horse and a prayer. Crime happened in shadows, and sometimes those shadows swallowed people whole. Young women especially had a nasty habit of disappearing without a trace. Newspapers from that era tell a grim story. Or the Tucson Citizen reported dozens of missing persons cases between 1870 and 1880 alone. Most were never solved. Why? Because there simply weren't enough lawmen to investigate, and even fewer people willing to talk. Wells made perfect hiding spots for evidence. Drop something down a 60-foot shaft, and good luck finding it again. But hiding a living person, that took a special kind of evil. Jake tested the rope again, then started his descent. The girl flinched when his boots hit the bottom, scrambling backward until the chain stopped her short. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Days or weeks of screaming for help had probably left her voice shattered. The weird part is how often this actually happened. Wells weren't just water sources, they became impromptu prisons when regular jails were too far away or too public. A determined criminal could keep someone down there for months if they played it right, lowering food and water just often enough to keep their victim alive. Rescue success rates were absolutely terrible. Most people who ended up in situations like this didn't make it out. The physical toll alone, malnutrition, dehydration, infections from those iron shackles, killed plenty before anyone even knew they were missing. Then there was the psychological damage. Survivors reported nightmares that lasted decades, trust issues that never healed. Some never spoke normally again, their voices permanently damaged from screaming into the void. Jake knelt beside the girl, moving slowly like he would with a spooked horse. "Easy now," he whispered. "I'm here to help." She finally found her voice though, it came out as barely a croak. They They said no one would ever find me. The shackles weren't some fancy prison equipment either, just rough ironwork, probably hammered out by a local blacksmith who asked no questions. The kind of metalwork you could get done for a few dollars, and a promise to keep quiet. But who were they, and why had they chosen this particular well in this particular town, to hide their crime? As Jake worked at the shackle locks with his knife, the girl began to whisper her story. What she revealed would shake this dusty frontier town to its core. The girl's trembling voice cracked as she whispered her story to Jake in the darkness. Her name was Emma, and she'd been caught in the middle of something deadly, a water war that had torn her small settlement apart. Water rights weren't just paperwork back then, they were life or death. Emma's father owned a small ranch upstream from the bigger cattle operations. When he dug a new well and started irrigating his crops, the downstream ranchers watched their own wells drop lower each day. Makes sense, right? Water flows downhill, and if someone's pumping upstream, everyone below feels it. But here's where things got ugly. Emma's family had every legal right to that water. The big ranchers didn't care about legal rights. They cared about their cattle dying of thirst and their profits disappearing. Arizona's irrigation boom in the 1870s transformed over 100,000 acres of desert into farmland, but it also created conflicts nobody saw coming. When you've got that much water moving around, someone's always getting squeezed out. Well, the threats started small. Mysterious problems with Emma's family well, rocks thrown down the shaft, equipment going missing. Then the water itself turned bitter one morning. Someone had dumped salt and worse things down their well during the night. Poisoning wells was a favorite dirty trick of the era, and it worked perfectly. The family couldn't drink their own water anymore. Emma's father refused to back down. He knew his neighbors were behind the sabotage, but proving it was another story entirely. Law enforcement was thin on the ground, and the sheriff happened to be the cousin of the biggest rancher in the valley. Funny how that works out. The breaking point came when Emma's younger brother got sick from the poisoned water. That's when her father made his fatal mistake. He rode into town demanding justice and threatening to dig even more wells. The next morning, armed men showed up at their ranch. Emma watched from the barn as they shot her parents and burned the house down, but they needed her alive. Why? Because Emma knew where her father had found the main spring feeding their well system. The ranchers figured they could force the location out of her, then claim the spring for themselves. Legal water rights meant nothing if there was no family left to claim them. That's how she ended up chained in the abandoned well. 3 weeks of darkness, scraps of food, and the constant drip of water just out of reach. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was dying of thirst while sitting in the middle of a water war. The statistics from that era tell the real story. In Arizona's fastest sinking valleys, the land dropped over 2 feet in just 14 years from well overuse. Entire regions were literally collapsing as people pumped groundwater faster than nature could replace it. When resources get that scarce, people do terrible things. Emma finished her story and looked up at the circle of light far above. Getting out was just the beginning. The men who killed her family were still in town, probably wondering why their prisoner hadn't broken yet. Jake hauled that rope like his life depended on it. The girl weighed almost nothing. Malnutrition had stolen most of her strength. When sunlight hit her face for the first time in weeks, she squinted and cried. Real tears this time, not the dry heaves that came from dehydration. Getting her to town sparked the biggest argument Jake had seen since arriving. Half the folks wanted justice served hot and fast. The other half, they knew exactly who had thrown this girl down that well, and those men had friends. Dangerous friends. Seawater wasn't just about survival in frontier towns, it was about control. Outlaws figured this out real quick. Whoever controlled the wells controlled everything else. They charge families for water access, demand protection fees, or flat out poison sources if people didn't pay up. Some corrupt sheriffs even helped, taking cuts of the water money while looking the other way. But here's where things get interesting. When regular folks got pushed too far, they pushed back hard. Vigilante groups started forming specifically to protect wells and water rights. These weren't your typical posses chasing horse thieves. These were organized citizens who'd had enough of water extortion. The rescued girl finally spoke after Doc Miller gave her some broth. Her voice came out like sandpaper, but her words hit like thunder. She named names. 3 men had grabbed her from her family's homestead after her father refused to sell his water rights. They'd kept her in that well as a warning to other families. Well, that warning just backfired spectacularly. Within an hour, Every able-bodied man in town had armed himself. The blacksmith brought his biggest hammer. The barber showed up with a straight razor that could split hairs or throats. Even old Mrs. Henderson packed her late husband's rifle, muttering about teaching manners to young men. The standoff happened right on Main Street, like something out of a dime novel. Except this wasn't fiction. This was 3 scared criminals facing down an entire town that had finally reached its breaking point. Turns out, when you mess with someone's water, you mess with their survival, and desperate people don't negotiate. The fight lasted maybe 10 minutes. The cleanup took considerably longer. Later, folks who survived similar ordeals in other frontier towns reported something troubling. Even after rescue, even after justice got served, they never fully trusted anyone again. Being trapped in darkness, dependent on captors for every drop of water, changes something deep inside a person's mind. The girl would flinch whenever she heard rope creaking. She'd hoard water in jars under her bed for months. That psychological damage was almost as common as the physical injuries. Wells that should have meant life and safety became symbols of terror instead. Jake watched the girl drink clean water from the town pump, taking small careful sips like she couldn't quite believe it was real. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, justice had won. The question now was whether this broken well could ever serve the community again, and whether this broken girl could heal alongside it. The dust had settled, literally and figuratively. Jake pulled the final bucket of murky water from the old well, tossing it aside as townspeople gathered around with shovels and rope. What had been a prison just days before was about to become salvation again. The girl Sarah, they learned her name, was pointed to cracks in the stone lining that needed repair. Her voice still shook when she spoke, but her knowledge of the well's construction surprised everyone. Turns out, her father had helped dig it years earlier before the water wars tore everything apart. She knew exactly where the good stone lay, and which sections would hold. Wells like this one weren't just holes in the ground. They were lifelines that determined whether entire communities lived or died. Some historic wells from the 1870s are still pumping water today, serving hundreds of people daily in towns across Arizona and Nevada. The residents mark them with brass plaques now, celebrating the engineering that kept their ancestors alive. But here's what's fascinating about well restoration: it's harder than building from scratch. Jake and the work crew had to clear decades of debris, test every stone for stability, and rebuild the pulley system that hauled water to the surface. The original rope had rotted away, of course. Sarah remembered her father saying the well was 63 feet deep, which meant they needed serious equipment to make repairs. Then there's the water quality issue. Wells abandoned for years often develop problems: contamination from surface runoff, mineral buildup, or worse. The townspeople brought in a traveling engineer, who tested the water source. Good news, the underground spring was still clean. Bad news, they'd need to install proper filtration before anyone could drink safely. Sarah worked alongside Jake, directing the repairs with surprising authority for someone who'd spent weeks chained at the bottom. Her trauma was obvious, but so was her determination to see this thing work again. Makes sense, right? She'd survived down there by understanding every detail of that stone prison. The restoration took 2 weeks. 20 families contributed labor, materials, or money. They rebuilt the stone lining, installed new rope and pulleys, and constructed a proper cover to prevent future accidents or crimes. Well, the irony wasn't lost on anyone. The same hole that nearly became Sarah's grave was now providing fresh water for the whole community. But the project revealed something troubling about water management in the West. Even then, people were drawing too much from underground sources. Some valleys were already sinking from overuse. Land that dropped 2 feet in 14 years, because wells were sucking aquifers dry. The townspeople celebrated their restored well with a community feast. Sarah smiled for the first time since her rescue. Jake stayed for the party, but kept glancing toward the horizon, because water wars don't end with one victory. They just move to the next valley, the next disputed claim. And somewhere out there, another community was probably fighting the same battle Jake had just helped win.